Good morning. I call to order the high-level conference on the situation of Rohingya Muslims and other minorities in Myanmar. I warmly welcome all of you to this conference. Pursuant to Resolution 79/278 of March 25, 2025, the objectives of the conference are to mobilize political support, sustain international attention on the crisis, review the overall crisis and address its root causes, including human rights issues, and share perspectives on the situation on the ground, including challenges faced by Rohingya and other minorities in Myanmar, as well as humanitarian issues within Myanmar and the region, in order to propose a comprehensive, innovative, and concrete plan for a sustainable resolution of the crisis, including efforts to create a conducive environment for the voluntary, safe, sustainable, and dignified return of Rohingya Muslims and other members of minority groups to Myanmar in a timely manner. I now give a statement in my role as the President of the General Assembly. Houses burned, neighborhoods killed, hope vanishing. Over the past 8 years, millions of Rohingya have been violently displaced from what they once knew as home. They fled with children on their backs, with nothing but the money in their pockets, on foot or by boat, for days, weeks at a time. Many have been living in refugee camps since the start of the crisis, with boys and girls spending their whole childhood in tattered tents, clinging to even the smallest fragment of hope for a better future. Excellencies, dear representatives of the Rohingya community here with us today, over 5 million Rohingya men, women, and children share some version of this story, whether as refugees in neighboring countries or internally displaced within Myanmar. 5 million. And the deteriorating political, humanitarian, and human rights situation in Myanmar is fueling more displacement. Armed conflict, violence against civilians, and targeted persecution of Rohingya people is increasing. Rohingya Muslims remain largely segregated and discriminated against with respect to enjoying their human rights and fundamental freedoms in Myanmar. Such situations have restricted the Rohingyas' freedom of movement, including their status of their identity and nationality. 8 years since their forced mass displacement from Rakhine State, the over 3.5 million Rohingya inside Myanmar are in desperate need of humanitarian assistance. And continued violence has forced more Rohingya Muslims to flee, including to Bangladesh, which is already hosting over 1.1 million refugees from Myanmar. This generous nation has opened its doors to those who need it most, but it cannot shoulder this burden indefinitely. The situation in Cox's Bazar, the world's largest refugee camp, is dire. Humanitarian assistance remains inadequate. Refugees often receive only 1 meal per day. Health services are extremely reduced. Even access to water is scarce. As one young refugee shared, if water is life, then life here is on hold because it doesn't flow where it should. In 2024, insufficient funding left more than 800,000 children without education, increasing girls' risk of child marriage, child labor, and sexual exploitation. As schools remain shuttered and assistance is merely a trickle, families are left to resort to desperate measures. As one Rohingya mother shared about her recently married 16-year-old daughter, I was afraid marriage was the only option. I just pray her husband lets her study. Even against this stark context, the humanitarian needs and response plan for Myanmar in 2025 is only 12% funded. As of September, with $140 million received out of the required $1.14 billion. Drastic cuts in international funding means essential services, from education to food to healthcare, are being cut when they are needed most. An estimated 1.1 million survivors of gender-based violence were left without critical support. This should put us to shame. This desperation is entirely preventable. As the Secretary General stated during his recent visit to Cox's Bazar, is ground zero for the impact of budget cuts. Excellencies, Bangladesh cannot bear this responsibility alone. We have to do more on funding. Everybody should ask themselves, 12% out of the need. We have to do something. In this regard, I would also welcome the important role played by ASEAN, as well as the Special Envoy on Myanmar, in facilitating constructive dialogue among all stakeholders, enabling humanitarian aid deliveries, and ending violence. Only through inclusive dialogue to address the root causes of the situation and to work towards a political solution will we be able to create the conditions for the voluntary, safe and dignified return and reintegration of Rohingya Muslims and other members of minority groups to Myanmar. But as we will hear later today, unfortunately, we are quite far away from this goal, as the situation on the ground remains challenging. And therefore, we cannot close our eyes to the situation at Cox's Bazar and the need for humanitarian assistance, the need of bringing 800,000 children back to school. While I wish to reiterate and stress the urgent need for strengthened international solidarity and increased support, that must be in parallel to efforts towards a comprehensive political solution that meaningfully includes the Rohingya and addresses their displacement and the root causes of the protracted crisis. Today is an important opportunity to listen to the voices of stakeholders, including civil society representatives who will share their perspectives and experience of the situation on the ground, as well as in the refugee camps. Rohingya need the support of the international community, not just in words, but in action. In this regard today, I call on member states to advance 4 key priorities: to facilitate safe, unhindered, and full access to humanitarian aid and assistance to all Rohingya and all minorities; to support sustained international engagement in Myanmar, including efforts led by the region and the Special Envoy on Myanmar; to ensure adequate, predictable, and sustained financing for humanitarian aid to meet the needs and demands on the ground, and to discuss the how to move forward with concrete steps, create a conducive environment for the voluntary, safe, sustainable, and dignified return of Rohingya Muslims and other members of minority groups to Myanmar, and reintegrate them into a place they once called home. Ladies and gentlemen, Rohingya men, women, and children have not chosen to live in a refugee camp. What they desire more than anything is to return to their homes, their neighborhoods, their schools, their lives. To live in peace and dignity, like all of us. As I said in my opening of the 80th General Debate, this hall was not built for the easy times, but it was built to come together to confront the hardest topics. So today, we face again a choice: to continue business as usual with lofty promises and commitments, or to act with the urgency this crisis demands. The Rohingya people have survived 8 years. Children have lived their whole life not at home. They survived 8 years of hardship, displacement, and uncertainty. Their resilience is extraordinary. Our response must match it. I thank you. I give the floor to Mr. Courtney Rattray, Chef de Cabinet of the Executive Office of the Secretary General, to deliver remarks on behalf of the Secretary General.
Excellencies, distinguished guests, dear colleagues, it is an honor to join you today. I would like to share a message from the United Nations Secretary General to mark this important occasion on the situation of human rights of Rohingya and other minorities in Myanmar. Excellencies, we gather today to shine a global spotlight on the persecution and displacement of Rohingya Muslims and other minorities in Myanmar. This crisis, which has deepened since the 2021 military takeover, tramples on the human dignity, rights, and safety of millions and threatens regional stability. It is not enough to take stock of the status quo. We must also foster solidarity and forge solutions. Minorities in Myanmar have endured decades of exclusion, abuse, and violence. The Rohingya have been stripped of their right to citizenship, targeted by hate speech, terrorized with deadly force and destruction, confined to IDP camps in Myanmar with severely limited freedom of movement and little access to education and health services. More than 1 million have sought refuge in Bangladesh, which has shown remarkable hospitality and generosity. Earlier this year, I had the privilege of traveling there on a solidarity visit during the holy month of Ramadan. I met with Rohingya refugees at Cox's Bazar and was deeply inspired by their courage and moved by their determination. Many shared chilling accounts of their ordeals in Myanmar. They want to go home. Myanmar is their homeland. But conditions in Myanmar's Rakhine state impede the possibility of their safe, voluntary, dignified, and sustainable return. Civilians are caught in the crossfire, subject to forced recruitment, aerial bombardment, and rampant human rights violations. In the past 18 months alone, 150,000 Rohingya have fled to Bangladesh, which has generously kept its borders open and given them refuge. Others risk perilous sea journeys that often end in tragedy. Daily life in the refugee camps is challenging too. Massive aid cuts have squeezed access to health care and stifled opportunities for learning and livelihoods. Food assistance risks running out at the end of November. Insecurity and exploitation put women and girls at heightened risk of sexual and gender-based violence, trafficking, and child marriage. We must work together to resolve the crisis affecting the Rohingya and other minorities in Myanmar. We must find a sustainable political solution that will shape a peaceful and inclusive future for all of Myanmar. As we work for that future, I urge you to demand immediate action in 3 crucial areas. First, all parties must respect international humanitarian law and international human rights law. The protection of civilians must be an immediate priority. Second, unhindered humanitarian access inside Myanmar must be guaranteed. No community should be cut off from food, medicine, and life-saving assistance. Third, we need reinvigorated humanitarian and development investment to meet basic needs, to help refugees transition from dependence to self-reliance, and to ease the strain on host communities. The people of Bangladesh have demonstrated enormous generosity, sharing their land, forests, scarce water, and limited resources. The international community must show greater solidarity to support Rohingya refugees and those who assist them. The solution to this crisis lies ultimately in Myanmar. It lies in ending persecution and discrimination, ensuring accountability, and restoring and upholding rights. It lies in a return to democracy and a recognition that the Rohingya belong as full citizens. It lies in building an inclusive society where all people, regardless of ethnicity or religion, can live in peace and participate fully and meaningfully in shaping their future. There can be no durable peace without a genuine cessation of hostilities and a path to de-escalation and dialogue. The Rohingya and all of Myanmar's people must be able to play a meaningful role in this process. They deserve justice, dignity, and safe return home. I call on each of you to contribute to efforts for a comprehensive, innovative, and concrete plan for a sustainable resolution of this crisis. Thank you.
I thank the Chef de Cabinet of the Executive Office of the Secretary General. I give the floor to Ms. Y.Y. New, Founder and Executive Director of the Women's Peace Network in Myanmar.
President, Excellencies, civil society colleagues, my fellow Rohingya and people of Myanmar, I am honored to speak to you today. My name is Wei Nu. I am the founder and executive director of Women's Peace Network, an organization advancing human rights, justice, gender equality, and peace. I thank the President of the General Assembly and her team, the Bangladesh Mission, and all member states for making this conference possible. This is a historic occasion for Myanmar, but it is long overdue. Our people have suffered enough. For ethnic minorities from Kachin to Rohingya, the suffering has spanned decades. Decades of displacement, oppressions, violence, and decades of inactions on war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. That cycle must end today. The conference must be the beginning of change, of a lasting solution over a temporary fix, one that is grounded in a pathway for the future that people of Myanmar define. We cannot just walk away from today after a series of statements. Instead, we need a concrete follow-up mechanisms, one that ensures sustained monitoring of the result of today's conference, clear benchmarks, and above all, the meaningful inclusions of the community's voices in all decisions about their futures. And it must immediately end the ongoing killing fields in Myanmar. As I speak, the Burmese military junta is continuing to commit mass atrocities all across the country. Airstrikes are killing women and children, youth are being forcibly conscripted, political prisoners are tortured, women and girls and LGBTQI+ people are raped as weapons of war. In Rakhine State, after decades of genocide, the Rohingya are facing a total, complete destruction. The junta Bloc 8 recruits Rohingya as human shield and continues systematic persecution. The genocide did not end in 2017. It has worsened. Rohingya are now being targeted by Arakan Army, the AA. Over the past 2 years, the AA has seized control of much of Rakhine, including the North and Bangladesh border. Despite promises, its actions mirror the junta: massacre, arson, torture, forced recruitment, forced transfer of people, and sexual violence. It is now denying aid to the Rohingya and is systematically starving them to death by confining them and restricting their movement. In northern Rakhine State, there has been no UN or international aid for over a year. Like the military, the AA is denying its atrocities, even publicly bashing UN reports on Myanmar. And like the military, the AA is denying the Rohingyas' indigenous identity, calling the Rohingya everything but their name. Meanwhile, the violence is also affecting everyone in Rakhine State. The junta is still confining 120,000 Rohingya in internally displaced persons camps in Sittwe. There, the military continues to abuse and deny basic human necessity, forcing them to suicide or flee by boat. The military is also attacking areas with ethnic Rakhine, Kaman, Dainet, Mro, and other minorities. Just a couple of weeks ago, the military bombed a boarding school at night, killing dozens of Rakhine children and injuring many. No one is spared. It is also true that armed groups that are undemocratically claiming to represent the Rohingya have collaborated with the military. The AA has taken these as excuses to inflict collective punishment on Rohingya civilians. And when it suits its goal, like improving image before this conference, AA would orchestrate a media campaign to whitewash its actions to the international community. But let me emphasize, a photo or video of a smiling Rohingya should never, ever erase the destruction that has been caused to the Rohingya. What the AA is doing now is detrimental to the people of Arakan and their common future. All I and my community have wanted is to live in peace with our diverse neighbor in our homeland. So if the AA also genuinely seeks coexistence, it can use its newfound power to take measures that allow for safe and voluntary return of Rohingya and ability not just to live, but thrive with equal rights. If there is a will, there is a way. It can easily protect Rohingya, allow aid to enter, hold perpetrators of atrocities accountable, and creates conditions for genuine, peaceful coexistence. Unfortunately, we know by now that that will not happen anytime soon. And that genocide victims and survivors are, when the genocide victims and survivors are at risk of exterminations by the multiple actors, there is no time to waste. The international community must immediately intervene to exercise its responsibility to protect the remaining Rohingya. Cross-border aid or a humanitarian corridor must be established along the Myanmar-Bangladesh border so that the life of the starving civilians can be saved. Targeted sanctions must be imposed on perpetrators of mass atrocities to diminish their capacity to brutalize more civilians. An independent body must be deployed to Rakhine State to monitor the situations and collect the evidence of atrocities. Without actions, Rohingya exodus will continue until there is no more Rohingya left in Myanmar. Excellencies, as long as atrocities against civilians continue, the refugee crisis will continue. This cycle of atrocities and mass displacement has spanned Myanmar's history. We saw this in 1978, in 1991, in 2017, and now again. I urge all of you to ask yourself, why do we see these patterns happening over and over again? Because for Rohingya and fellow ethnic minorities, the answer has always been clear: impunity. For 70 years, the military has escaped justice. The impunity emboldened others to follow. Ending impunity is the only way to end atrocities. Therefore, international community must end this impunity that is at the root of all atrocities. Perpetrators of atrocities against civilians must be held accountable. Justice is not optional. It is the only deterrent, the only path to peace. Effective justice and accountability initiatives are crucial in deterring actors from committing more atrocities. And with effective international support, these holistic forms of deterrence can establish framework of lasting peace. Lasting peace is a necessary precondition for the repatriation Rohingya and all other refugees. Excellencies, let me emphasize this again. Lasting peace in Myanmar fundamentally depends on justice and accountability. And lasting peace can happen in a federal democracy where the Rohingya and other ethnic minorities have constitutionally granted equal rights and self-determinations and are free to exercise them. The international community thus must prioritize meaningful engagement with the pro-democracy movement over the military. All the people of Myanmar want is the military to be held accountable and kept out of politics. By now, we know that soft diplomacy is clearly not enough to change the military's illegal, brutal behavior. Soft diplomacy only prolongs the country's crisis. And when there is so much human suffering already, there is no time to waste. The international community must take all measures to dismantle its failed approach and build a practical one. I thus urge the international community to move beyond ASEAN 5-point consensus. It has failed the people of Myanmar over 4 years. There is no consensus as long as the military is free to violate it. The international community must condemn the military's upcoming sham election. Accepting election as an exit strategy will only bring more violence, thus more refugees from Myanmar. Ultimately, creating conditions for more mass displacement is impractical, especially when the will and capacity to protect refugees is diminishing. From Bangladesh to Malaysia, funding cuts have devastated the life of over 1 million refugees, as well as the hundreds of thousands of more people in exile from Myanmar. Government must immediately resume their life-saving aid and expand it. Steps must be taken to strengthen refugees' resiliency. Like Thailand, host countries must allow refugees to at least work. And access to education is critical for refugee children, especially Rohingya youth in Cox's Bazar. The international community must fulfill its duty to protect refugees. Instead of detentions, deportation, provide access to the safe disembarkations, asylum, and domestic legal processes. Protection is especially crucial for Rohingya women and girls. They continue to face brutal forms of violence as refugees, even after fleeing genocide. This is intolerable. Excellencies, you already have the evidence. You already have the power. What is missing is the political will. The people of Myanmar demand accountability and an end to impunity and an end to oppressions. Let this conference be a historic turning point, the end of missed opportunities and the beginning of the lasting solution. Thank you.
I thank Ms. New. I give the floor to Ms. Julie Bishop, Special Envoy of the Secretary General to Myanmar.
Madam President, Excellencies, this conference is focused on the situation of Rohingya Muslims and other minorities in Myanmar. However, a sustainable solution will require a settlement of the political crisis in Myanmar, fuelled by the military takeover in February 2021 and the armed conflict that has evolved across the country. The plight of the Rohingya and other minorities has persisted for decades, and now, through the bitter internal conflict, the broader population is also suffering the consequences of war, casualties, displacement, and growing humanitarian needs. Women and children are disproportionately affected. Myanmar's multifaceted crisis requires our immediate attention and urgent action. It is not easy to gain attention, and as the United Nations meeting of world leaders highlighted last week, there is a significant level of global turmoil and armed conflict. Yet people within Myanmar and along its borders are also suffering and are deserving of our support. The violence continues between the military and ethnic armed organisations and People's Defence Forces. There is no agreed ceasefire. There is no agreed pathway to peace. There is no agreed political solution. Human rights violations continue with impunity. In my role as Special Envoy of the Secretary-General on Myanmar, I have heard from all the voices of Myanmar and listened to the conflicting perspectives while remaining impartial and upholding United Nations values and principles in order to help support and promote a Myanmar-led, sustainable, inclusive and peaceful political solution. As part of my efforts to engage with all parties, I visited Myanmar again last week, my third visit, and met with State Security and Peace Commission leaders. I met for the second time with Senior General Min Aung Hlaing in Naypyidaw. It's over 4.5 years since the military takeover, and while the fighting has been intense and the military has lost territory to ethnic armed organisations and others, There were expectations that there will be territorial gains during the process for the proposed election. A zero-sum mentality persists across this highly polarised nation. The initial international condemnation of the military takeover has subsided, and the Senior General has been welcomed to high-level regional meetings with global and regional leaders. His visits include to the capitals of Security Council member states, and reference was made to instances of the lifting of sanctions. The SSPC, which replaced the State Administration Council, or SAC, after the expiration of the state of emergency on 31st of July, is preparing for elections to be held in 3 phases commencing on 28 December in 102 out of 330 townships, with tightened security measures introduced in anticipation of violent disruption of the election process. The Union Election Commission is preparing voter lists, party registration and candidate nominations. The SSPC is planning an event to commemorate the 10th anniversary of the nationwide ceasefire agreement. It is proposed to be a peace forum with invitations extended to supporters of the NCA and a range of stakeholders, including diplomats and other actors. I met with representatives of the National Unity Government this week, as well as a number of Rohingya groups and civil society organisations. I have regular conversations with ethnic armed organisations and other parties. There is significant risk that the election planned for December, under current circumstances, will increase resistance, protest and violence and further undermine the fragile state of this country. Views of ASEAN members range from strident opposition to the holding of elections under current circumstances, to resignation of the inevitable, to vocal support for elections as a potential circuit breaker. The National League for Democracy, whose leaders remain under detention along with other political prisoners, has reiterated that it does not recognise the SSPC's plan to hold polls in limited areas, calling the exercise a sham attempt to gain political legitimacy. As to the Rohingya forcibly displaced, again from Myanmar more than 8 years ago, the escalating conflict in the country presents a seemingly insurmountable barrier to their return. In my meetings with Rohingya, including over recent days with refugees living in Cox's Bazar, they have called for an end to violence by all sides and the beginning of a journey toward peace, self-reliance and the realisation of their rights. Rohingya provided concrete examples of confidence-building measures that could be trialled among diverse communities and outlined potential pathways toward inclusive dialogue, while underscoring that accountability for all actors was critical for reconciliation. An inclusive Myanmar is only possible if it guarantees safety, justice and opportunity for all communities, most critically the Rohingya, and addresses the root causes of conflict, discrimination and disenfranchisement. As one representative put it, this is not just about survival, it's about recognition. I visited Cox's Bazar in February, where I heard directly from some of the 1.2 million Rohingya refugees who live in the crowded camps. They shared aspirations for further education, upskilling and employment that would afford them dignity and self-reliance. They wish to return home to Rakhine, to rebuild their lives and become leaders of their communities with control over their destiny. They also spoke of new challenges posed by funding shortfalls, including shrinking opportunities for schooling and livelihoods. They highlighted the increasing vulnerability of some communities, and particularly Rohingya women and youth, to criminal elements who capitalise on the desperate situation. Some have risked dangerous sea journeys in search of safety and opportunity. Despite the generosity of donors, the reality is that the needs of the Rohingya in Bangladesh are outpacing resources at an alarming rate. The 2025 Joint Response Plan for the Rohingya humanitarian crisis is currently only 37% funded. This is already having dire consequences for the Rohingya in camps, with critical cuts to their food rations and a sharp decline in access to education, the World Food Programme in Bangladesh, warned this month that without new contributions, food assistance for the entire Rohingya community will come to a complete halt in 2 months. UNICEF has announced the suspension of major segments of its education program for both Rohingya refugees and Bangladesh host communities in Cox's Bazar. As the Secretary-General has highlighted, there is an urgent need for strengthened international solidarity and increased support in concert with efforts towards a comprehensive political solution that meaningfully includes the Rohingya. As Rohingya refugees continue to push for a return home, addressing root causes of the crisis and sustaining efforts that improve the well-being of all communities in Rakhine State is more critical than ever. The Advisory Commission on Rakhine State, headed by the late Kofi Annan, underscored the pervasive poverty among both Rakhine and Muslim communities and the importance of addressing the low levels of socio-economic development and enhancing intercommunal dialogue and reconciliation. Women, Rohingya, ethnic Rakhine, as well as other minorities in the state, have also reportedly faced increasing sexual and gender-based violence from a range of armed groups. The fear and trauma among survivors and their communities has been deep and persistent. Civilians have also been caught in an increasingly complex conflict involving the Myanmar military, the Arakan army, and other armed groups, with some civilians, including children, subjected to forced recruitment and other abuses. In my engagement with all parties, I've underscored their responsibility to allow for unfettered access for the delivery of humanitarian assistance and other forms of essential services, adhere to international humanitarian law and civilian protection, and have called on them to prevent further incitement of communal tensions. I continue to call for an end to aerial bombardment targeting civilian infrastructure, while the military maintains a narrative that justifies the bombings as a necessary action against groups they label terrorists, with comparisons to other conflicts. I will continue working closely with ASEAN, its chair, special envoy and member states. This partnership remains essential, particularly as the regional implications of the crisis continue to grow. If left to fester, more will fall prey to transnational criminal networks, cyber scamming and drugs in neighbouring countries and beyond. I acknowledge the leadership of Malaysia as ASEAN chair and its efforts to foster dialogue among Myanmar actors and the international community. A coherent international approach must be grounded in a collective regional response. We must also strengthen regional protection efforts to provide access to conflict-affected communities and further support host countries. In addition to ASEAN, forging strong cooperation with other neighbouring countries will remain a priority. I continue to engage with the European Union, the Organisation of Islamic Cooperation and others who have the capacity to influence outcomes. These actors in particular have a stake in Myanmar's peace and are positioned to influence positive change. I specifically look to the global Muslim community to, at the very least, provide greater financial support to the plight of their Rohingya brothers and sisters. I thank Professor Muhammad Yunus, Chief Advisor of the Interim Government of Bangladesh, for his leadership and for his commitment to finding a lasting solution. And I thank Bangladesh and other host countries for continuing to bear the responsibility of sheltering over 1 million Rohingya refugees. People deserve to live with dignity while longer-term solutions are pursued that permit them to return home. An inclusive, peaceful, sustainable future for Myanmar must guarantee safety, accountability and equity for all communities, including Rohingya Muslims and other minorities, while tackling the root causes of conflict, discrimination and exclusion. We are yet to find the common ground or willingness to compromise that will bring the myriad parties to the negotiating table. Time is not on our side.
I thank the Special Envoy of the Secretary-General on Myanmar. I give the floor to Mr. Rafiq Hassan, founder of the Arakan Youth Peace Network.
Madam President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates. Good morning, everyone. I am human rights defender and the founder of ASEAN Youth Peace Network, which works to promote peace, social harmony, and human rights among the communities in Rakhine State and beyond. As a Rohingya, I have faced systematic discrimination, including being denied the right to study higher education in my country, Myanmar, including myself. The systematic architecture of genocide against Rohingya has shaped not only my personal life, but also my deep commitment to justice and my determination to advocate for the Rohingya and other marginalized communities. As part of my work, I have closely witnessed the devastating impact of conflict on the Rohingya and other population. Since coup in Myanmar 2021, 3.6 million people have been displaced, 1.5 million have fled as refugees, and 22 million people need urgent humanitarian aid across Myanmar. On top of these crises, the Rohingya are also victims of a systemic, decades-long genocide. The persecution, mass displacement, and destruction of my people predates the current conflict. But recent fightings and events have compounded and exacerbated our suffering. For example, around 200,000 Rohingya have been confined in detention camps since 2012 racial violence in situ Rakhine State. Their homes and lands have been confiscated, and they depend almost entirely on the international humanitarian aid. On 13th of November 2023, fighting broke out between Myanmar junta military and the Rakhine army, which is predominantly a Rakhine Buddhist armed group fighting for greater autonomy. As a result, the junta blocked all humanitarian access and cut telecommunication, leaving the communities in a state of unimaginable suffering and facing starvation. In what World Food Programme has described as a full-blown disaster. As a witness to the 13th of November 2023 conflict, when I was in Myanmar, I saw the junta's forced conscription of 10 ages, men and elders from the Rohingya community in Rakhine State. After a mere 10 days of training, they were used as human shield in the battlefield, such as Military Operation Command 15, Butitong, 536, 537, 538, Light Infantry Division, Ratitang. In just 1 week, at least 400 Rohingya were killed. Hundreds of Rohingya have been forcibly conscripted by junta since 2023. The forced conscription continues in situ today. It is clear that this is a tactic used by junta to inflame tension and to incite conflict between Rakhine and Rohingya. Such debate rules and tactics have been used by junta in past, for example, in inciting conflict in 2012. The junta has also escalated aerial bombardment across the country, including by using 500 palm bombs, causing rising civilian casualties. In Shokto, Rakhine State, at least 20 Rakhine students were recently killed by such bombing. Meanwhile, the Rakhine army also forcibly conscripted Rohingya and have carried out arbitrary arrests, torture, massacre, and village burden. One of the gravest atrocities was Tan Shao Keng Hoyasari massacre, in which over 600 Rohingya were killed. On 17 May 2024, after capturing the Butitong, Rakhine army burned to ash the almost entire central Butitong, which is predominantly Rohingya area. Tens of thousands attempt to flee. Along the way, they were blocked, looted, beaten, or killed. Survivor describes scenes of horror, civilians trapped inside their burning homes, and families separated. These atrocities forcibly displaced over 200,000 Rohingya in a single day marking one of the darkest movements since genocidal campaign of 2017. On 5 August 2024, an River bank drone attack killed more than 200 civilians, most of them women and children. The United Nations High Commission Office for Human Rights, Amnesty International, and the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar, Human Rights Watch 45 Right, affirmed that both Myanmar military and the Arakan army have committed and continue to commit crimes against humanity against Rohingya with complete impunity. In 2017, during Myanmar military's clearance operation, which quickly turned into a campaign of terror, killed thousands of Rohingya, burned down hundreds of villages, engaged in systematic sexual violence, and forced nearly 1 million Rohingya into neighboring country, Bangladesh. We hope that international pressure, international law would end the impunity, but our suffering continues. Today, once again, more than 150,000 Rohingya have been forcibly displaced into Bangladesh. Hundreds of thousands remain trapped inside the Rakhine state, facing ongoing genocidal conditions. Excellencies, despite these decades of persecution, our deepest wish as Rohingya is to live peacefully and securely, together with diverse community, including Rakhines and others, in our ancestral homeland, with safety and security. Yet, the past decade has shown that it's not possible for us without international support, without international pressure. The impunity goes on. Ending the crisis of insecurity for the Rohingya community is a task for this assembly and a task for the humanity itself. The Rohingya are on the brink. We can keep struggling and practicing resilience, but we can't survive in Myanmar without international protection. Repatriation will only be possible with genuine international protection. Without credible guarantees, justice, and security, any return would risk the repeating cycles of persecution and mass displacement. I therefore urgently call on all UN member states to establish a United Nations supervised safe zone for the Rohingya in northern Rakhine State, supported by ASEAN and other regional stakeholders to guarantee the protection of all civilians. To facilitate cross-border or humanitarian corridor from the ground of Bangladesh to ensure the sustained delivery of life-saving assistance. These are the obligations under the international law, under the Charter of the United Nations. The International Court of Justice has already ordered Myanmar to protect the Rohingya from the acts of genocide. This is now the responsibility of this assembly to ensure these orders are implemented. Excellencies, the time to act is now. The lives of hundreds of thousands of Rohingya depend on the decision you make in this assembly. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Husson. I give the floor to Mr. Filippo Grandi, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees.
Madam President, delegates, civil society representatives, and colleagues, I recently visited Myanmar and saw how a country already dealing with a devastating humanitarian crisis was still reeling from the aftermath of the recent earthquake. Let me therefore join others in welcoming this conference. You have heard from Special Envoy Julie Bishop about the political challenges. As in other crises, and given the way conflicts are conducted by parties across the country, too often disregarding the rules of war, civilians, as we heard this morning, are killed, wounded, and deprived of the basics. More than 5 million are displaced, of whom more than 1.5 million have taken refuge in neighboring countries. In my own discussions with the de facto authorities in Naypyidaw, I have reiterated the requests of humanitarian agencies on the ground. We need safe and unhindered access to people impacted by the fighting. I have received some assurances, but these urgent and vital asks must be continuously conveyed by all those who can do so. Within the broader context of Myanmar, and mindful that today's conference aims to address the situation of all minorities, I would like to focus in particular on the situation of the Rohingya population, which my organization, UNHCR, has worked with for many, many years. Their plight is somehow unique. Not only do they continue to be discriminated, deprived of rights, and abused, a situation they have endured for decades, but they're also caught in one of several ethnic conflicts affecting the country, except it is not their own, the one pitching the Arakan army in Rakhine State against the de facto authorities. The Rohingya people, as we have heard, have faced challenges for a long time, not just in the past 8 years. But 8 years ago, confronted with unspeakable violence at the hands of Myanmar's military, 750,000 fled to Bangladesh. Others became displaced in Rakhine State. With the advances of the Arakan army, which now controls almost all the state, their situation has not improved. Discrimination, the burning of their villages, the exclusion from work and services, the continuous denial of their very identity. The Rohingyas live with the threat of arbitrary arrest and detention, with restricted access to healthcare and education. They cannot move freely. They're subjected to forced labor and forced recruitment. Their lives are defined every day by racism and fear. Madam President, for these reasons, I want to reiterate my gratitude to countries in the region that for years have hosted refugees from Myanmar, and especially Rohingya refugees, such as Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand. In particular, I wish to pay tribute to the people and the leadership of Bangladesh. The Honorable Chief Advisor, Professor Yunus, is here, for hosting close to 1.2 million Rohingya refugees. Since the fighting reignited in Rakhine in 2024, as we heard, another 150,000 individuals arrived in Bangladesh seeking safety. Yet, despite enormous challenges, Bangladesh continues to host them, setting an example to the rest of the world, showing us that compassion is still possible at a time when indifference and inaction are sadly fast becoming the norm, showing that giving asylum to refugees saves lives. I appreciate that hosting such a large refugee population, however, is a burden. Therefore, let me praise countries who are taking positive steps to enact policies that allow refugees to build self-reliance. International financial institutions, the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank in particular, have also played a critical role, providing over $1.25 billion to invest in programs aiming to strengthen both refugee and host community resilience. The private sector, too, is playing its part, and we hope that much more can be done, especially in the critical sectors of education, skills development, and livelihoods. But host countries, as has been repeated many times this morning, cannot shoulder that responsibility alone. The humanitarian response in Bangladesh remains chronically underfunded, including in key areas like food and cooking fuel. The prospects for funding next year are grim. Unless further resources are forthcoming, despite the needs, we will be forced to make more cuts while striving to minimize the risk of losing lives, children dying of malnutrition, or people dying at sea as more refugees embark on dangerous boat journeys. We must do more. Please, I call on all of you. And in addition to funding, it is critical to offer solutions in line with the pledges made at the last Global Refugee Forum, solutions such as resettlement, as well as other pathways to hope through education or labor mobility. No assistance is too small, especially when the alternative leads to more instability in the region and to more costly measures further down the line. The most important, however, is not to forget that this crisis originates in Myanmar. And that, Madam President, is where the solution lies. We have said this many times. It has been said today here. But we cannot keep going down the path of inertia and somehow expect a resolution while an entire population continues to waste away. The recommendations of the Rakhine Advisory Commission remain as relevant as ever and must inform our engagement towards the voluntary, safe, and sustainable return of Rohingya refugees to their homes, as is their right, and with the full involvement, by the way, of refugees themselves. But without taking bolder actions, the situation is unlikely to change, and these are issues that humanitarians cannot resolve alone. Countries with influence in the region must intensify their engagement to help create the conditions for change. I mentioned that point to the diplomatic community when I was in Yangon. This must include efforts to utilize communication channels with all parties to the conflict in Rakhine to convey this message, not only with the de facto authorities, but also the Arakan army. And while recent reconciliatory gestures on their part are a step in the right direction, we must pursue with more unity, coherence, and determination some key objectives, such as re-establishing humanitarian presence in northern Rakhine and access, whichever way is most appropriate in future return areas. Resume confidence-building measures started by UNHCR and UNDP years ago and now severely limited by insecurity and other constraints. Insist with those with control over camps still hosting internally displaced people to address their plight and genuinely pursue just and durable solutions. Because that is the lesson we draw from developments in other parts of the world. Syria, for instance, or the situation between the Democratic Republic of Congo and Rwanda. Different contexts, certainly, but ones that show that it is possible through sustained political engagement and innovative approaches to alter the trajectory of conflicts that appear to be intractable. We have no other choice if we want to chart a new course for the people of Myanmar, one that is principled, pragmatic, and forward-looking, and if we want to bring a lasting solution to the plight of the Rohingya people. UNHCR stands ready to support. We will continue to work with member states, regional bodies, civil society, refugee-led organizations to raise resources and advance protection, resilience, and solutions for all displaced people within and from Myanmar. Thank you.
I thank the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. I give the floor to Ms. Lucky Karim, Executive Director of Refugee Women for Peace and Justice.
Thank you, Madam President, Excellencies, Member States, UN agencies, international organizations, civil society. I'm deeply honored today to be representing my community, along with my 3 other Rohingya colleagues here. In August 2017, on a Sunday evening at 4 p.m., 1 week before the Eid festival, when I was only 14 years old, my family and I were forced to flee my home in Rakhine State, Myanmar. We managed to cross the nearest border of Myanmar into Bangladesh. We collapsed on the ground in a field packed with thousands of other injured and terrified people. Within weeks, nearly 1 million people became refugees in the world-largest refugee camp in Cox's Bazar, Bangladesh. I lived there for 6 years, until December of 2022. The violence committed against us in 2017 was the culmination of a decades-long process of genocide, a process that continues to this day. Today, I want to discuss the condition faced by our people and share recommendations and requests I hear from my community. However, I also want us to recognize that there is a long road ahead. We know our goal to return to our homeland safely with rights. But how do we get there? We must carefully consider each step along that long road to fulfill our goal. We cannot shy away from asking hard questions about immediate, medium, and long-term needs. And we should be humble enough to recognize that we have not yet found the answers. But we, Rohingya ourselves, are best placed to find sustainable solutions for our future, with support from the international community. I first want to thank Bangladesh for initiating this conference. Every refugee is deeply grateful to the government of Bangladesh and its people for providing us with refuge. Thankfully, Rohingya voices were finally included in formal conversations about our own fate for the first time at a stakeholders dialogue in Cox's Bazar last month. The interim government has also shown openness to allowing greater self-resilience as we continue to shelter in the camps. But we have also suffered deeply in the dangerous and overcrowded camps because of restrictions on livelihood opportunities. We're largely dependent on food rations provided by the UN. A lost generations of Rohingya, people just like myself, have had zero formal education in the last 8 years. Our bamboo and tarpaulin shelters are in disrepair. Health services are barely enough to address their primary needs, though security has improved this year. Safety remains a major concern after forcibly recruiting hundreds of young people to support the military's fight against the Ark army last year. The armed groups remain powerful in the camps, committing abductions, extortion, and satisfying Rohingya civil society. These conditions and conditions in Rakhine State have forced thousands of women and children to risk their lives by fleeing to neighboring countries like India, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand. In the hopes of better life, many died en route, while others faced arrests or pushbacks. Those lucky enough to arrive at their destination are not welcomed or recognized as refugees. And this was the situation even before massive decreases in humanitarian assistance. And tens of thousands more Rohingya people fled Rakhine State since the beginning of last year, bringing the camp population to 1.3 million people, more than half women and children. Earlier this year, I became the first resettled Rohingya to return back to the refugee camps in Bangladesh, and I returned again last month. The community members I met shared with me how aid cards are impacting them. Healthcare facilities have closed. Recent arrivals from Rakhine State must take shelters in families already cramped hearts, and Rohingya volunteers have lost their jobs and the stipends that help them to meet their basic needs. Excellencies, almost the entire Rakhine State is now under control of the Ark army. As my colleague Wewenu has already described the ongoing abuses and security crisis faced by the Rohingya there, and humanitarian crisis is extremely dire. But the military's genocide against us has been systematic for decades. It is a process. Rohingya have been refugees to Bangladesh numerous times, even before 2017, and we keep going back and forth to Myanmar. And it has been never sustainable. A sustainable solution must be found within Rakhine State and within Myanmar. Excellencies, all of the refugees I spoke with on my recent trips to Bangladesh had a lot of questions about their lives. What might their future look like? When they can go back home? And it broke my heart to say goodbye without a clear answer. We know the ultimate solution to the Rohingya crisis. We need voluntarily safe and dignified repatriation to our homes in Myanmar. But how do we get there? I do not have all the answers, but I do want to pose some additional questions. How do we prepare for repatriation when people in Rakhine State are starving, suffering from the impacts of conflict, and still trying to flee? How do we prepare for political solutions in Rakhine State if we do not have a counterpart willing to engage in conversations about our future? How do we prepare for peaceful coexistence with other communities in Rakhine State, given all of the trauma we have suffered? How can Rohingya build political power without a strong representative civil society when we have little authority to make decisions? And when most in Myanmar view our suffering as an afterthought amidst ongoing conflict across the country? How do we do any of these things if we do not have food to eat or shelters over our heads. Excellencies, amidst many competing crises, we are concerned that our plight will fall by the wayside. But based on what I have heard from Rohingya in Rakhine, recently arrived from Myanmar in the camps in Bangladesh, from diaspora, and from my own lived experience, the Rohingya community would like to play a leadership role in finding a solution for ourselves. We would like friends in the international community to play a supporting role for the more than 1 million refugees in the camps in Bangladesh. Donors and the host governments must ensure the basic rights and needs for refugees and host population in Bangladesh and elsewhere in the region are met, including by providing formal quality education for the Rohingya that follows the Burmese curriculum, ensuring access to livelihood opportunities, ensuring justice and accountability mechanism, and in arbitrary detention of refugees, refraining from refoulement of Rohingya back to Myanmar. For the Rohingya in Rakhine State, Myanmar, donors and the international community must provide cross-border aid into Rakhine State, ensuring humanitarian actors can operate freely and address the crisis facing Rohingya and other ethnic minorities, and pressing authorities to allow internally displaced people to return to their homes safely and without any restrictions. For all Rohingya who seek to return in safety and dignity to our homeland, countries of influence must support the Rohingya to achieve our goal of a voluntarily safe and dignified repatriation to our homes, Myanmar, and to facilitate the best broad-based participation of Rohingya in political dialogue regarding our future in Myanmar. On behalf of the Rohingya community, I thank and appreciate all donor countries, all stakeholders, member states, UN agencies, host government for your generosity, for your continued support, solidarity, and attention. I call on the international community to use this conference as a first step towards the goal of a safe, sustainable returns and to continue directly engaging with us in finding a solution for us. I really hope you all implement these recommendations and take actions immediately until everyone is safe in Myanmar. Thank you.
I thank the Executive Director of Refugee Women for Peace and Justice. I give the floor to Mr. Volker Türk, High Commissioner for Human Rights.
Madam President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates. Thank you for the opportunity to address this high-level conference. Today, life in Myanmar, especially in Rakhine State, may be the worst it has ever been for the Rohingya and other minorities, making another grim chapter in the long history of persecution. I witnessed the utter deprivation and hopelessness of Rohingya when I visited northern Rakhine in my previous position in UNHCR, and I saw it especially in the eyes of women and girls I met. It is almost unimaginable that since then their situation has deteriorated. So this conference must send a very clear signal that this injustice is at the top of the global political agenda. And it needs to be a turning point for the Rohingya, for the international community to take action and to devise a lasting solution to their plight. Since November 2023, fighting in Rakhine has escalated, with Rohingya being targeted from all sides, and we have heard it in particular from the civil society representatives here today. The Myanmar military has increasingly used aerial attacks against civilians across Rakhine. It has committed grave violations of human rights and atrocity crimes, including deliberately killing civilians, destroying civilian property, arbitrarily detaining and torturing people, and forcibly conscripting them into its ranks. Some of the images and videos in northern Rakhine from the second half of 2024 are reminiscent of the atrocities of 2017. Airstrikes and artillery barrages are also devastating other minority communities, including ethnic Rakhine, Mro, Maramagi, Hindu, and Cayman, resulting in untold numbers of killings and mass displacement. Rohingya have reported that their movement is increasingly restricted, their communications monitored, mobile phones seized, and there are internet shutdowns. Meanwhile, on its path to acquiring territory, the Arakan army has reportedly killed, abducted, tortured, arbitrarily detained, and forcibly recruited Rohingya. They have burned or destroyed homes, places of worship, and entire villages. The Arakan army is arresting Rohingya for allegedly supporting the military or Rohingya armed groups, for possessing telephones, traveling without authorization, and resisting forced recruitment. Many of those arrested, including children as young as 14, have been missing for months, raising concerns they may have been forcibly disappeared. Arakan army units have also arrested, detained, and extorted money from families after they returned from Bangladesh to Mongdo in northern Rakhine. Some were sent back to Bangladesh if they paid the Arakan army, while others, unable to pay, remain in detention. Madam President, the humanitarian situation continues to deteriorate in Rakhine and across the country, as military blockades have severely restricted access. Nearly a third of the country's population, some 15.2 million people, are facing acute food insecurity this year. That represents an increase of almost 2 million people in a year. All these conditions, and we have heard from the High Commissioner for Refugees, have displaced over 3.5 million people within the country and pushed an additional 150,000 Rohingya to Bangladesh since January 2024. Insecurity in the refugee camps in Bangladesh is deepening, leaving people in even greater fear and despair. Armed groups, including the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army, prey on families, they extort money from them, and forcibly recruit boys and young men. Amid growing violations, violence, and restricted humanitarian access, the military is organizing elections in Myanmar to be held under total military control. Elections under these conditions can be neither free nor fair. For example, Rohingya will not be able to vote because they have been stripped arbitrarily of their citizenship. Ethnic Rakhine parties have been disqualified from running. Frankly, how can such elections be supported? They neither reflect the legitimate aspirations of the Myanmar people nor create a foundation for lasting peace. In fact, the danger is even more violence. The way out of this crisis is through de-escalation, protection of civilians, dialogue, humanitarian access, not elections. Madam President, the situation is clearly not conducive for the voluntary, safe, and sustainable return of Rohingya. As long as violence and discrimination against the Rohingya and other minorities persist, this will continue to be the case. I see 5 areas requiring urgent attention. First, the violence must end. The military must implement Security Council Resolution 2669, which demands an immediate end to the violence, urges the release of arbitrarily detained people, and calls for constructive dialogue, reconciliation, and respect for human rights. All parties need to allow unhindered humanitarian relief to civilians in need and to lift all restrictions. States with influence over the parties need to press for a ceasefire and recommit to peacebuilding. Peace efforts need to address the root causes of this conflict, including the persecution of the Rohingya and other minorities that has entrenched divisions and fueled conflict for decades across Myanmar. They also need to pursue accountability for the horrific crimes that have been committed. States need urgently to stop the flow of arms into Myanmar, including jet fuel and dual-use goods. I welcome the imposition by several countries and one regional organization of targeted sanctions against individuals and companies in Myanmar. Second, sustained financial support, including humanitarian aid to all communities in Myanmar and the Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh is absolutely crucial. For nearly a decade, Bangladesh has hosted refugees despite its own challenges. Without predictable funding, people will be plunged into deeper despair and exposed to higher risks of violence and exploitation. Third, States need to do everything possible to protect people fleeing the conflict. This includes, importantly, full respect for the fundamental principle of non-refoulement, including at the border, as well as search and rescue operations at sea. I urge states to ensure effective access to international protection, including through safe and dignified pathways such as resettlement. Fourth, Myanmar needs to respect in full the provisional measures imposed by the International Court of Justice to protect Rohingya lives, and there needs to be full accountability for the grave violations and abuses committed by the military, the Arakan Army, and other parties. I repeat my call for the Security Council to refer the whole situation in Myanmar to the International Criminal Court. Finally, we need to heed the Rohingyas' calls for peace and freedom. They want the freedom to move, to work, to raise their children in safety, and to get on with their lives. They want their Myanmar citizenship to be restored and fully recognized. They want their voices heard meaningfully in peace efforts. They want to be part of a democratic Myanmar free from military dominance. And those displaced within Myanmar and across borders want to return home in safety and dignity when the conditions are ripe. Madam President, the violence, the extreme deprivation, and the massive violations of human rights have fueled a crisis of grave international concern. The international community must honor its responsibilities and act. We stand in solidarity with the Rohingya and all the people of Myanmar in their hour of greatest need. Their most fervent wish is a viable future for Myanmar in which all communities can thrive, free from discrimination, marginalization, and fear, and live in peace. Thank you very much.
I thank the High Commissioner for Human Rights. I give the floor to Mr. Maung Sayedala, founder of the Rohingya Students Network.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Excellencies, distinguished representatives of the UN, member state, and civil society organization. Minglaba. This Burmese greeting means, may you be blessed. Before I continue, I humbly invite you to a brief moment of silence to honor the countless Rohingya men, women, and children whose lives have been lost to violence and persecution. Thank you. Today, my first message is for those watching me in my country, Myanmar. Dear brothers and sisters, you are not forgotten. You might feel the world does not see you are suffering. Rohingya see you. Rohingya feel your pain. Our hearts cry to see the brutality of military you face every day in Rakhine, Shang, Shin, Kachin, Kayin, Mung, Wa, and all around Myanmar. Rohingya have been fighting the military brutality for decades. Let us get hand in hand, work together until democracy, justice, peace, and equal rights for all in Myanmar are restored. Now, this message is for the UN and the world leaders. It has already been more than 8 years since the Rohingya genocide was exposed. Where is justice for Rohingya? Where? The remaining Rohingya in Arakan, Rakhine State in Myanmar continue to face the deadliest attack. But this time, at the hand of Rakhine rebel group Arakan Army, which is even more worse than the atrocities committed by the military junta. These people were killed in a drone attack by the Arakan Army on 5th August 2024. More than 200 Rohingya men, women, and children were killed there. Another 600 Rohingya civilians were massacred by Arakan Army. These are not isolated cases. They are a part of a systematic campaign. Why is there no prevention to these inhuman atrocities committed by the Arakan Army? We see there are some lobbies and there are some people who promote the solution of Rohingya as legitimizing Arakan Army. They must feel ashamed. Giving legitimacy to Arakan Army without a solution or a condition for Rohingya is giving them a license to erase all the Rohingya from Myanmar. There was a dialogue process between the leaders of Arakan Army and some Rohingya youth in the camp. I was a member of the Rohingya delegations. During the dialogue process, they demanded our submissions and refused to discuss the real issues. Power imbalance was a great problem there. Without self-determination for Rohingya and international protections in Arakan, there cannot be any fair or lasting peace. Any initiative about Rohingya without the Rohingya in the camp, from decision making to nation building, is unsustainable and unjust. The UN must mobilize resources to empower Rohingya. We are not just victims. We have the potential to make a difference. Take me as an example. I fled Myanmar during the 2017 military genocide, and I was in the refugee camp in Bangladesh for 7 years. Understanding the importance of education for Rohingya, I applied to more than 150 universities all around the world. But most of them said no because of legal obstacle and because of my identity as a Rohingya. But I didn't give up. Today, I am a student at New York University, making history as the first Rohingya from the refugee camp in Bangladesh to be studying here. Thanks to the US, State Department, and the government, and the Bangladesh, and some other organizations and friends, especially Amnesty International, Young Activist Summit, DAB TV, and Victim Advocate International, and all of my friends who have been supporting me behind to make this possible. There are thousands of Rohingya students like me in the refugee camp, forced to destroy their life with no access to higher education. Why does the world care so little about that? Why is there no initiative to support Rohingya students? Imagine, I came all the way from the refugee camp to the New York University, and I may have to stop my studies from the next semester because of not having financial support. It is not a big burden for a university to offer 1 or 2 scholarships to Rohingya students per academic year. An university in Bangladesh called Asian University for Women, AUW, already has been providing scholarship to Rohingya girls. Why can't other universities accept Rohingya boys? The world must support universities like AUW and push other universities to help Rohingya get access to higher education. It is also not a big burden for member states to offer some scholarship to Rohingya students annually. I'm grateful to the great Philippines and Japan for already creating example by providing some scholarship to Rohingya students. I request member states to join these countries and open their doors to higher education for Rohingya students. Excellencies, while we work to deliver justice to Rohingya, we must not leave Rohingya suffer and Rohingya go through uncertainty and adversity. There are 4,700 Rohingya in indefinite detention in Malaysia. There are hundreds of Rohingya in India also face detention and even deportation to the genocide in Myanmar. Again, now I want to remind everyone that the world urgently needs to prevent the ongoing genocide against Rohingya in Arakan before it is too late. And there must not be any justification for the atrocities committed by both military and Arakan army. These perpetrators must be held accountable. Rohingya in Myanmar, Bangladesh, Malaysia, Indonesia, and other countries in the regions are in great need of protections and humanitarian assistance. We want ASEAN to play a role to be helping these people. To let us lead our life and create our future, give us access to higher education. Now, I want to pause my remarks, requesting this assembly for a specific, measurable, achievable, and realistic plan for a sustainable solution of the Rohingya crisis. Long live Arakan! Long live Arakan! Long live Rohang! Long live Rohang! Thank you. Thank you so much.
I thank Mr. Soyet Dala. I give the floor to Mr. Othman Hashim, Special Envoy of the ASEAN Chair on Myanmar.
Madam President, Excellencies, delegates, at the outset, I thank you for inviting me to participate in this high-level conference in my capacity as the Special Envoy of ASEAN Chair on Myanmar. This conference comes at a critical juncture against the backdrop of the ongoing crisis in Myanmar and immense challenges on the humanitarian front worldwide. My mandate as the Special Envoy of the ASEAN Chair on Myanmar is derived from the ASEAN 5-point consensus adopted by the ASEAN leaders in April 2021. In discharging my mandate, I have undertaken engagements with a wide spectrum of Myanmar stakeholders, which also include Rohingyas and other minorities in Myanmar. Unfortunately, the persistence of hostilities in Myanmar is severely impacting civilian populations in the country. This is particularly true in Rakhine State, where fighting between the Myanmar military and ethnic arms organizations, as well as between arms groups, continue. The people of Rakhine State are being subjected to compounding challenges, from ongoing violence to the blockade of humanitarian assistance, deepening the humanitarian catastrophe. These hardships faced by the population of Rakhine State, particularly the Rohingyas, is not new. It is another episode of an ongoing plight predating the 2021 coup. And in the case of Rohingyas and some minorities, exacerbated by their non-recognitions as the ethnic groups of Myanmar. The dire situation in Myanmar has led to mass internal displacements and has forced Rohingyas and other minorities to flee the country to countries neighboring or close to Myanmar. The large influx of refugees from Myanmar is putting a strain on these countries. The persistent conflicts globally has brought about unprecedented demands on humanitarian assistance. With reduction in humanitarian fundings, humanitarians are forced to make difficult choices. Unfortunately, Myanmar is among those conflicts impacted by this situation. The devastating earthquake that struck Myanmar in late March has drastically increased the number of those in need. Deteriorating circumstances continue when in April this year, the World Food Programme has forced to cut emergency assistance to 1 million people due to the severe funding shortfalls. I commend donors who have made contributions to the World Food Programs for Myanmar in recent months. However, humanitarian needs in Myanmar remains staggering. In addition to critically low funding, humanitarian efforts in Myanmar face hindrances in reaching populations in need, especially in areas not under the control of the military and areas of active hostilities. Madam President, inclusive dialogue is a key imperative in finding a peaceful resolutions to the crisis in Myanmar. Rohingyas and other minorities are often excluded from dialogue, primarily due to their non-recognition as ethnic groups of Myanmar. Worse, they continue to be subjected of discriminations and persecutions. In my engagements with Myanmar stakeholders, I have emphasized that peace in Myanmar will remain elusive until inclusive dialogues between all Myanmar stakeholders take place. The situation in Myanmar, particularly the plight of the Rohingyas and other minorities, must be reversed. This requires actions all parties, both within and beyond Myanmar. For actions within Myanmar, the crucial first step is stopping the hostilities and violence. Prolonged violence will only exacerbate the misery of the people of Myanmar, Rohingyas, and other minorities included. It is also important that humanitarian assistance is not politicized by warring parties and allowed to reach all those in need without impediment. There is an urgent need for a more comprehensive and systematic mechanism by the State Security and Peace Commissions of Myanmar to engage with all Myanmar stakeholders, including the Rohingyas and other minorities. My office stands ready to offer good offices in this regard. It is also necessary to address the long-standing injustice against the Rohingyas and other minorities. They should be treated no different than other ethnic groups in Myanmar and must be allowed to return to their homeland in a safe, voluntary, and dignified manner. Additionally, the international community must step up to help alleviate the dire situations of the Myanmar people. Funding for humanitarian programs in Myanmar should be restored and scaled up. Such assistance could be channeled through multilateral institutions such as the United Nations, regional mechanisms such as the ASEAN Coordinating Center for Humanitarian Assistance on Disaster Management, or even bilaterally to Myanmar. Countries neighboring Myanmar should also consider establishing cross-border aid delivery mechanisms to ensure that civilian populations in need of humanitarian assistance can receive such aid. The international community must also contribute to peace-building and nation-building efforts in Myanmar to strengthen governance, structures, and resilience of the country. The United Nations can play a significant role in these efforts. Madam President, before I conclude, I wish to reiterate that the crisis in Myanmar, as well as the predicament faced by Rohingyas and other minorities, have gone on for far too long. Conferences such as these are important as they help maintain the international community's attentions towards the plight of the Rohingyas and other minorities in Myanmar. However, what is more important is the next steps to be taken in order to address the situation of the Rohingyas and other minorities. All parties, both within and beyond Myanmar, must take concrete steps in order to attain a durable and sustainable solutions to the crisis in Myanmar, as well as the plights of the Rohingyas and other minorities. In line with my mandate, under the 5-point consensus, I will continue engaging all Myanmar stakeholders, pushing for the cessation of violence, the unimpeded flow of humanitarian assistance, as well as inclusive dialogue among all the parties. Thank you very much.
I thank the Special Envoy of the ASEAN Chair on Myanmar. We've heard the last speaker for the opening segment. I would like to express my appreciation to our distinguished speakers for their contributions. We will now begin the plenary segment. Before giving the floor to the first speaker, I would like to remind delegations that in order to allow maximum participation by all, the time limit will be 3 minutes for national statements and 5 minutes for statements made on behalf of a group of states. The time limit for statements will be strictly enforced, including through microphone cutoff. Having said this, I appeal to all speakers to deliver their statements at a reasonable pace to facilitate interpretation into the 6 official languages. I now give the floor to His Excellency Muhammad Yunus, Chief Advisor of the Interim Government of the People's Republic of Bangladesh.
Excellencies, 8 years since genocide began, the plight of Rohingyas continues. Initiatives to end the crisis are lacking. International funding faces alarming shortfalls. Rohingya crisis originated in Myanmar. Its solution lies in Myanmar. The international community must put effective pressure on Myanmar and their economy to immediately stop persecution of the Rohingyas and start working for their expeditious repatriation to Rakhine. It is the only solution of the crisis. It should not be held hostage to broader reforms in Myanmar. As funding declines, the only peaceful option is to begin their repatriation. This will entail far fewer resources than continuing their international protection. The Rohingyas have consistently pronounced their desire to go back home. As an immediate step, those who recently crossed into Bangladesh, escaping conflict, must be allowed to repatriate. Bangladesh is a victim of the crisis. We are forced to bear huge financial, social, and environmental costs. Criminal activities, including narco flows into Bangladesh through Rakhine, threaten our social fabric. Given our development challenges, including unemployment and poverty, we do not afford to allow employment of Rohingyas inside Bangladesh. Towards a sustainable resolution of the crisis, I propose the following actions by the international community. First, devise a practical roadmap for safe, dignified repatriation of the Rohingyas with reasonable and stabilization of Rakhine. Second, exert effective pressure on Myanmar and the Arakan army to end violence against Rohingya and start their sustainable repatriation, beginning with those who recently arrived in Bangladesh and those who are internally displaced. Third, mobilize international support to stabilize Rakhine and place international civilian presence to monitor stabilization. Fourth, support confidence-building measures for sustainable integration of Rohingya in Rakhine society and governance. Fifth, mobilize donor contribution to fully fund the joint response plan. Sixth, pursue accountability and restorative justice. Seventh, dismantle the narco economy and combat transboundary crimes. The world cannot keep Rohingya waiting any longer.
I thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. I give the floor to His Excellency Sugiorno, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Indonesia.
Madam President, Excellencies, amidst today's global challenges, we must not allow the plight of millions of Rohingya to fade into silence. Their suffering remains our urgent concern. The Rohingya tragedy is inseparable from Myanmar's crisis. Therefore, lasting peace can only be achieved by addressing root causes through inclusive dialogue, in line with the 5-point consensus. Only then can all stakeholders be represented, and the path to democracy and safe, dignified return for the Rohingya be realized. At the same time, transnational organized crimes continue to exploit their vulnerability. Thousands have arrived on Indonesia's shores in recent years, many as victims of trafficking and people smuggling. Indonesia will act firmly against these criminal networks, but of course, no country can act alone. This is why ASEAN and the Bali process must be supported. A durable solution must be designed with a truly regional perspective and anchored in shared responsibility. Both ASEAN and the Bali process are crucial in addressing irregular migration and protecting vulnerable communities. International coordination is equally vital. Countries hosting refugees need sustained support. Cooperation with UNODC, UNHCR, and IOM must be deepened. I call on all stakeholders to scale up humanitarian assistance in a sustainable way, and I also urge parties to the 1951 Refugee Convention to open their doors wider, to accept more refugees and expand, third, country resettlement programs. Excellencies, 8 years of displacement is already far too long. We cannot allow it to become decades of despair. Together, let's restore hope and dignity to the Rohingya people. I thank you.
I thank the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Indonesia and now give the floor to His Excellency Dauda Jallow, Minister of Justice of the Gambia.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor for the Gambia to participate in this high-level conference on the situation of Rohingya Muslims and other minorities in Myanmar. We condemn in the strongest terms the continued violence, war crimes, atrocity crimes, and human rights violations, abuses targeting Rohingya Muslims and other minorities throughout Myanmar, and particularly in Rakhine State. We also express our deepest concern over the ongoing humanitarian crisis throughout Myanmar, and in particular Rakhine State, which has displaced hundreds of thousands of people, forcing many of them once again across the border into Bangladesh to seek safety. Your Excellencies, there is a long history of crimes perpetrated against the Rohingya people and other minority groups in Myanmar. And until the impunity for such crimes ends, the perpetrators will continue to commit them. We must collectively act to end the cycle of impunity and support justice and accountability for the people of Myanmar. It is for that reason that the Gambia took the solemn responsibility of filing the genocide case against Myanmar at the International Court of Justice in response to the genocidal clearance operation of 2017. Those targeted attacks against the Rohingya, which included the murder of thousands of men, women, and children, as well as systematic sexual violence and burning down hundreds of villages, were meant to destroy the Rohingya as a group in Myanmar. We filed our case in November 2019, almost 6 years ago. Now we are preparing for the oral hearing on the merits in this case, which the court has scheduled for mid-January 2026. At this hearing, the Gambia will present its case as to why Myanmar is responsible for Rohingya genocide and must make reparations to its victims. We hope for a judgment from the court to be issued soon thereafter. We welcome the international support that we have been received for this case, including with 11 states intervening to share their views with the court. Your Excellencies, this Assembly has a vital role to play in rallying international action for a comprehensive solution facing the Rohingya and other minorities in Myanmar to ensure their safety, security, dignity in a Myanmar that respects the rights of all of its people. Accountability to ensure justice, reparations, and non-reparative atrocity crimes is an essential part of that comprehensive solution, and we appreciate your continued support to that end.
I thank the Minister of Justice of the Gambia and now give the floor to His Excellency Anders Adlercreutz, Minister of Education of Finland.
Madam President, Excellencies, Finland remains deeply concerned about the continuing conflict in Myanmar and the widespread violation of human rights, lack of humanitarian access, and the prolonged displacement of Rohingya Muslims and other minorities. The hostilities continue to obstruct prospects for peace and well-being for all in Myanmar. They prevent Myanmar from realizing its tremendous potential for modernization, sustainable development, and prosperity. The people of Myanmar, including the Rohingya and other minorities, youth, and those living in exile, urgently need hope. It's the responsibility of the United Nations and all of us to work harder to offer hope. As our former President Martti Ahtisaari said, all conflicts can be solved. With political will, an opportunity is at hand for a comprehensive ceasefire and for de-escalation, dialogue, and humanitarian access, as outlined in the ASEAN 5-point consensus. The core elements of a peace process need to be addressed, such as questions related to inclusive dialogue and constitution. Inclusive democratic development is possible also in Myanmar. For the Rohingyas, a voluntary, safe, dignified, and sustainable return requires a truly conductive environment. It's the task of this conference to identify steps needed for it. They include an end to the hostilities, full humanitarian access, respect of human rights, confidence and peace building between parties and communities, demining, creating opportunities for livelihoods, good governance, and solving the question of citizenship. As the Rohingya youth have underlined, to build a future while in exile, they also need education opportunities and job creation, as well as mental and psychosocial support. We commend countries that host large numbers of Rohingya refugees, in particular Bangladesh, for their extraordinary efforts. The Rohingya refugees deserve continued international support, both in Rakhine State and in refugee camps. Finland stands with the people of Myanmar and supports the efforts of the UN and ASEAN special envoys, neighboring countries, and the EU in seeking an inclusive, credible, and practical peace process, a process that would benefit Myanmar and open new prospects for the whole region. This conference must send a clear message. Amid many crises in the world, Myanmar's plight is not forgotten, and the international community remains committed to supporting its path towards peace, justice, and sustainable development. Thank you.
I thank the Minister of Education of Finland and now give the floor to His Excellency Sultan Muhammad Al-Shamsi, Assistant Minister of Foreign Affairs for Development and International Organization of the United Arab Emirates.
We are meeting today, and while we are meeting, and 8 years after their collective displacement from Rakhine, the Rohingya Muslims and other minorities in Myanmar are still suffering systemic violence and forced displacement in light of a worsening humanitarian crisis. Since this crisis began, and based on our humanitarian commitment, we have stood beside the Rohingya refugees and other minorities in Myanmar through providing basic humanitarian assistance in order to alleviate their suffering. We have also called for a comprehensive and just solution for this crisis in line with international law principles. In this context, we express our deep concern regarding the continuous grave violations that are being committed against the Rohingya refugees, especially in light of the horrific latest reports regarding sexual and gender-based violence, which targets specifically women and girls. Within the framework of the efforts of the UAE, we have provided humanitarian assistance, and we will continue to provide assistance and to implement humanitarian initiatives which embody part of the steadfast commitment that we have to improve the humanitarian situation of those who have been displaced by crisis. Considering the deteriorating situation of the Rohingya refugees, it is necessary for the international community to double their efforts to protect and provide support to the Rohingya refugees and the host communities, specifically Bangladesh. And there is a vital role for humanitarian assistance to alleviate the suffering for these refugees. And this is true, but it is not enough if there are no political and diplomatic international efforts that deal with the root causes of this crisis. In addition to participation to create the conditions for the voluntary, safe, and dignified return of refugees. In conclusion, the urgent need to deal with the current status of the Rohingya refugees is a real test for our collective conscience and the genuine nature of our commitment to the principles upon which this organization has been founded. It is time to work together to develop a comprehensive, time-bound plan that leads to ending this crisis once and for all. Thank you.
I thank the Assistant Minister of the United Arab Emirates and now give the floor to His Excellency Charles Harder, Special Envoy for Best Future Generations of the United States.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to the President of the General Assembly and all speakers today. The United States expresses its support for Rohingya and other Myanmar minorities who have been victims of repression and violence. Survivors of that persecution are here with us today. I commend their bravery in speaking out. We thank the government of Bangladesh as they have shown generosity and compassion in hosting Rohingya refugees, many of whom fled a campaign of genocide and crimes against humanity perpetuated by Myanmar's military. We also thank Thailand for its steadfast partnership, including its recent decision to grant Myanmar refugees permission to work. Unfortunately, Myanmar's military regime continues to escape accountability for their atrocities. They continue to oppress minorities, bomb civilians, and use child soldiers. We are deeply concerned about reports of ongoing atrocities and forced displacement, particularly in Rakhine State. We call on all armed actors, including the military regime and the Arkan Army, to protect civilians, allow humanitarian access, and adhere to international humanitarian law. Despite ASEAN and UN efforts to create conditions for dialogue, violence and instability have only worsened. The regime is moving ahead with an election plan that excludes the most popular and representative political parties. This plan will not address the legitimate aspirations of Myanmar's ethnic groups. We reject these elections under current conditions. Our goal is a future in which all people of Myanmar can live in safety, dignity, and peace. Our focus now should be on a ceasefire, a genuine dialogue which is critical to shape the country's future. In the meantime, the United States has been committed to international effort to provide humanitarian assistance for Rohingya refugees. This is not a burden the United States will bear indefinitely. It is long past time for other governments and actors in the region to develop sustainable solutions for Rohingya. All nations, organizations, and private donors must step forward and share the burden by increasing their contributions. The scale and complexity of this crisis make it clear that no single country or entity can do it alone. To underscore the U.S. commitment in saving lives and providing critical assistance where needed, today I am announcing our intent to provide more than $60 million in assistance for Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh. With this, we expect meaningful policy changes by Bangladesh to allow livelihood.
I thank the Special Envoy of the United States and now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Myanmar.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, all protocol observed. The situation of Rohingya Muslims represents a protracted and severe humanitarian and human rights crisis. The challenges facing the Rohingya, encompassing those remaining in Myanmar and those subsisting as protracted refugees in host countries, are complex and multifaceted. Many have already said the various challenges. I will not state again here. Madam President, Myanmar remains indebted to the host countries. We also appreciate the host countries for improving living conditions of refugees and their access to health and education services, as well as employment opportunities. The current reality, including continued area attacks by the military junta across Myanmar, including Rakhine State, overshadows any near-term prospect for safe, dignified, and voluntary repatriations of Rohingya. The reports of UN Special Rapporteurs and IIMM provide a common message that the human rights situation in Myanmar dire. The clear reason for this lies with the military juntas and lawful military coup. They are the sole culprit and the root cause to the destruction of Myanmar peace and security. For over 4 years, all people of Myanmar have struggled for their lives in the midst of junta's atrocities. The National Unity Government adopted a policy position on Rohingya in 2021 and commits to resolve the crisis as part of overwhelming ambitions. To create a conclusive environment for repatriation, first and foremost, we must end this military dictatorship and its atrocities against civilians, and we all need to double our effort to build trust and unity among us. At the same time, we all have to respect and adhere to the international humanitarian law and international human rights law to make each and every individual enjoy their fundamental rights. In this regard, the role of our neighboring countries, the regional organization, and international community, including the United Nations, is so much important. Here is my humble advice to you all. Since you know well of unspeakable suffering of the people of Myanmar, including Rohingya, please do not support the military junta politically, militarily, and financially, and strongly reject the junta's planned scam election. Finally, Madam President, resolving the situation of Rohingya Muslims and other minorities in Myanmar will not be possible unless we address the root cause. We can yield results only by acting together to end the military dictatorship, its unlawful coup, and its culture of impunity.
I thank the representative of Myanmar, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Switzerland.
Madame la Présidente.
Madam President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Switzerland thanks the President of the General Assembly for convening this important high-level conference and the valuable efforts undertaken by the co-chairs. We particularly welcome the participation of representatives of the Rohingya community, some of whom have already shared their powerful testimonies this morning. Having served as ambassador of Switzerland to the Republic of the Union of Myanmar, I remain deeply moved by the hardship and suffering its people continue to endure. Switzerland condemns all violations of international humanitarian law and human rights violations and abuses in Myanmar, including those against Rohingya and other ethnic and religious minorities. Despite global efforts, violence persists. Attacks on civilians, forced recruitment, arbitrary detentions, and systemic discrimination. The humanitarian crisis has worsened alarmingly due to ongoing military offensives and blockades to essential aid. The reports of extrajudicial killings, enforced disappearances, and torture, particularly within detention facilities, represent very serious violations of international obligations and demand immediate attention. Switzerland firmly calls for the unconditional release of all arbitrarily detained persons and urges respect for international law, including Security Council Resolution 2669. We condemn obstructing humanitarian assistance in Myanmar, which worsens the plight of displaced persons, especially Rohingya and other minorities. In this dire situation, rapid, safe, and unimpeded humanitarian access must be ensured immediately. Without an end to hostilities and without stability and security in Rakhine, the conditions for a safe, voluntary, and dignified return of the Rohingya refugees to Myanmar are not met. Against this backdrop, Switzerland also recognises the outstanding and challenging role Bangladesh is playing in hosting over 1 million Rohingya refugees. Switzerland will continue supporting Bangladesh in its response to the Rohingya crisis, according to international law and humanitarian principles. Accountability remains central. Ladies and gentlemen, Switzerland calls for full and impartial investigations into violations and abuses of human rights and international humanitarian law. We reaffirm our unwavering support for the independent investigative mechanism for Myanmar, and we stress the importance of cooperation with accountability processes, particularly the International Criminal Court.
I thank the representative of Switzerland and now give the floor to the distinguished representative of France.
Madam President, ladies and gentlemen, it has now been more than 4 years that the military junta has been inflicting its strategy of indiscriminate violence, its capture of power in 2021. Since then, it has been systematically carrying out blind bombings, torture, air strikes and other atrocities against the civilian population. They target schools, health facilities, religious sites. Many children have been killed, wounded, and there is numerous sexual violence committed. France is extremely concerned by the continued worsening of the situation for Rohingya and other minorities. Their suffering, discrimination and forced displacement, be it by the armed groups or the junta, is unacceptable. These practices must end. Violations of human rights and international humanitarian law must be held to account. Justice is a crucial precondition for lasting peace. That's why France supports the work of the International Criminal Court, which is investigating crimes committed against the Rohingya. We also support, since its establishment, the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Burma, which has facilitated investigations into the gravest international crimes that have been committed and repeated since 2011. France stands alongside the European Union, the main humanitarian donor in Burma, to provide the necessary support. We strengthened our action in 2024 with more than 11 million euros and 6 million for the humanitarian response for the forcefully displaced population and refugees in neighbouring countries, particularly the Rohingya and Bangladesh. We call on the international community to further mobilize alongside us, particularly financially, in a context in which the situation in Burma and that of the Rohingya is being overcome by other media crises. The return of displaced persons is a priority, but we cannot do this without security, without access to rights, and without recognized citizenship. Free movement, access to education and healthcare are essential. Deep-rooted reforms are needed to ensure this can happen. France supports the efforts of the Special Envoy, the Secretary General, and ASEAN to find an inclusive political solution to the root causes of the crisis. We encourage regional dialogue and cooperation with all states and organizations concerned, and we demand the implication of Resolution 1659 of the Security Council. We welcome the work of UN personnel to ensure that there can be prospects for the future and humanitarian assistance. We encourage the authorities in Naypyidaw to engage in dialogue that would respect the population with the international community. Fighting impunity is an essential precondition to overcome this crisis. Finally, we call on the states present to join our efforts to protect the population, Rohingya and other minorities.
I thank the representative of France and now give the floor to the distinguished representative of New Zealand.
We thank the President for convening this important high-level conference on Rohingya Muslims and other minorities in Myanmar. We also acknowledge the attention of the United Nations Security Council on the situation in Myanmar. including briefings from the United Nations Special Envoy for Myanmar and the ASEAN Special Envoy for Myanmar in April. And we commend the leadership of the United Nations in supporting the work of the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar and Special Rapporteur in collecting evidence of serious crimes against the people of Myanmar, including to support ongoing justice processes related to crimes committed against Rohingya. New Zealand remains deeply concerned about the continuing conflict, the deteriorating humanitarian situation, and the continued violation of the fundamental rights of Rohingya Muslims and other minorities in Myanmar. The food crisis in Rakhine State is particularly alarming, where a combination of conflict, blockades, and reductions in funding has driven an acute rise in food insecurity and malnutrition. New Zealand calls for rapid, safe, and unimpeded humanitarian access. Food and medicine must urgently be allowed in to save lives. New Zealand remains deeply concerned by reports of escalating war crimes and crimes against humanity committed across Myanmar, and condemns the regime's use of airstrikes causing civilian deaths and widespread destruction. We strongly urge an end to the violence and the establishment of genuine and inclusive political dialogue amongst all stakeholders. Elections held without these essential steps risk further instability. We call for the return of Rohingya people to Myanmar. Any return must be safe and voluntary. All relevant parties must take measures to ensure full protection of human rights for minorities and to support the international justice and accountability process. In closing, we commend Bangladesh for hosting so many Rohingya refugees and acknowledge the hard work of humanitarian organizations delivering assistance in both Bangladesh and Myanmar. New Zealand has contributed $38 million to humanitarian responses in Myanmar and $41 million to the Rohingya refugee response in Bangladesh since July 2017. And we remain committed to supporting these critical responses. Thank you.
I thank the representative of New Zealand and now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the European Union on behalf of the EU and its member states.
I'm honored to deliver this statement on behalf of the European Union's member states. The candidate countries North Macedonia, Montenegro, Albania, Ukraine, the Republic of Moldova, Bosnia and Herzegovina, as well as Iceland, Andorra, Monaco, and San Marino align themselves with this statement. It has now been 8 long years since the actions of the Myanmar military caused the mass displacement of Rohingya people. 8 years of uprooted lives, lost homes, and shattered futures. The humanitarian security situation continues to deteriorate in Myanmar, with escalating conflict compounding the suffering of the Rohingya and other vulnerable groups. This year alone, over 150,000 Rohingya were forced to flee to Bangladesh. Bangladesh's generosity in providing shelter and safety to over 1.1 million Rohingya refugees is commendable and saved lives. But prospects for a durable solution remain distant. This high-level conference is therefore both important and timely. The European Union and its member states remain deeply concerned about the dire humanitarian situation in Rakhine State. We strongly call on all parties, especially the Myanmar military, to immediately grant full, safe, and unhindered access for humanitarian actors to deliver life-saving assistance. We also strongly condemn the ongoing violence and grave human rights violations and abuses in Myanmar. All attacks against the civilian population must cease immediately. Myanmar must return to a democratic path, respecting the will and aspirations of its people. We call on the military to immediately cease indiscriminate aerial bombings, which are blatant violations of international humanitarian law. Colleagues, the Rohingya refugee crisis cannot be solved without addressing Myanmar's wider crisis in a comprehensive and holistic manner. In this regard, we support the ASEAN's efforts towards achieving the 5-point consensus. We take a clear stance against measures that could lead to premature repatriation of Rohingya refugees in conditions that are not safe, voluntary, dignified, and sustainable. The European Union's member states remain committed to helping establish the conditions necessary for the return of the Rohingya to Myanmar. These conditions require addressing the root causes of displacement, including statelessness, denial of citizenship, and systematic discrimination. Colleagues, the international community must sustain and scale up its support. Since 2017, the European Union has committed over €500 million in humanitarian and development assistance for the Rohingya crisis in Myanmar, Bangladesh, and the region. But more is needed, and we encourage additional partners to step up contributions. It is more critical than ever to find ways of providing the Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh the appropriate skills and capacities which can be used to sustain a decent and dignified life until an upon return. Waning international support risks fueling tensions among refugees and also between host communities. Aid cuts deepen desperation. Preventing future radicalization and instrumentalization of Rohingya requires urgent concrete action that offers young people peaceful and viable alternatives. We commend the work of the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar, the International Criminal Court, and the International Criminal Court of Justice for pursuing accountability efforts to bring justice to the victims of atrocity crimes. To break the cycle of impunity, those responsible must be held to account. The Rohingya and other minorities deserve a future in Myanmar that guarantees their dignity, safe return, full citizenship, and equal rights. This is not a nice to have. This is a must have, and it is an international legal obligation. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the European Union and now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Latvia on behalf of Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania.
Madam President, Excellencies, delegates, I speak on behalf of the Baltic states, Estonia, Lithuania, and my own country, Latvia. We welcome the convening of this conference. It is both timely and necessary to renew international attention to the suffering endured by the Rohingya and the other minorities as a result of the ongoing conflict in Myanmar. At the outset, I wish to acknowledge and commend the generosity of Bangladesh for hosting over 1 million Rohingya refugees, as well as the efforts of ASEAN and regional partners to achieve a durable outcome to the Rohingya crisis. Madam President, our aim is clear: the voluntary, safe, dignified, and sustainable return of refugees and internally displaced persons to their homes. Achieving this goal requires an end to violence, addressing the root causes of the conflict, and rebuilding trust among communities. These are long-term undertakings. Repairing institutions, reversing discriminatory policies, and reintegrating displaced populations cannot happen overnight. Yet there are actions that not only can, but must be taken immediately. First, compliance with international law. Credible reports indicate widespread violations of international human rights and humanitarian law committed against civilians. These include arbitrary arrests of political opponents, abduction and forced recruitment of children, indiscriminate aerial bombardments by the Myanmar military that kill and injure civilians and destroy infrastructure, sexual and gender-based violence, the burning of homes, attacks on humanitarian workers and facilities, and restrictions on humanitarian access imposed by both the military regime and various armed groups. Natural disasters have deepened the crisis. In the past year, a powerful typhoon triggered floods and forced displacement, while a major earthquake claimed thousands of lives and shattered communities. Despite the destruction, conflict persisted. Airstrikes continued even in the hardest hit regions. Madam President, in the face of ongoing conflict, it must be underlined that international humanitarian law demands adherence to the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution. It requires that hospitals, schools, and places of worship are not targeted. It calls for concrete measures to mitigate harm to civilians. It also mandates full, safe, and unimpeded humanitarian access. These are not suggestions, they are obligations. To uphold these obligations, accountability must be ensured. We commend the work of the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar, the International Criminal Court, and the International Court of Justice in advancing justice and accountability. The second immediate action is the inclusion of women in building sustainable peace. Women and girls have suffered immensely in this conflict, as they do in all conflicts. Yet they are also powerful agents of change. The women, peace, and security agenda is clear. Political processes must include women fully, equally, and meaningfully. This is how ceasefires hold. This is how communities heal. This is how peace endures. We call for women's leadership in all negotiations, across all tracks, from local mediation to national dialogue, from humanitarian planning to security sector reform. Madam President, let me conclude by emphasizing that these priorities align with the decisions of the Security Council, which has called for an immediate end to violence, full and unhindered humanitarian access, the protection of civilians under international humanitarian law, and the full, equal, and meaningful participation of women in the peace and security process. If the violence stops and humanitarian access is granted, food supply chains can stabilize, health services can resume, and children can return to learning. These are the foundational conditions for achieving our shared goal, the voluntary, safe, dignified, and sustainable return of refugees and internally displaced persons to their homes. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Latvia and now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Turkey on behalf of Organization of Islamic Cooperation.
Madam President, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. The OIC reaffirms its unwavering solidarity with the Rohingya people who have endured decades of systematic discrimination, violence, and displacement. We are alarmed by the recent reports of killings, forced displacement, and destruction of property in Rakhine State perpetrated by the Myanmar Army, Myanmar military, and the Arakan Army. These atrocities, as credible assessments confirm, are part of a deliberate and systematic strategy of ethnic cleansing against the Rohingya Muslims. We recall General Assembly Resolution 79/278, which convenes this conference and emphasizes the urgent need for justice and accountability. The OIC underscores the landmark orders of the International Court of Justice, beginning with the January 20 provisional measures that require Myanmar to prevent genocide and preserve evidence, as well as the Court's July 2022 ruling rejecting Myanmar's preliminary objections. Therefore, Myanmar must fully comply with these binding decisions. We commend the Gambia for its leadership in pursuing this case before the ICJ and remain convinced of the full support of OIC member states to continue to support this joint effort. Furthermore, OIC welcomes support of Canada, Denmark, France, Germany, the Netherlands, and the United Kingdom for this legal case. It is also important to underscore that the court will hold a critical hearing on the merits of this legal case in January 26 at the ICJ headquarters in The Hague. We further call on the international community to intensify their diplomatic pressure, impose targeted sanctions, and take concrete measures to end impunity and ensure justice for the Rohingya people. Excellencies, OIC recognizes that the voluntary, safe, dignified, and sustainable return of the Rohingya people to their homeland in Rakhine State is the only durable solution. This requires addressing the root causes of the crisis, restoring the full citizenship rights of the Rohingya people, providing security, creating conditions conducive for their voluntary and dignified repatriation. In the meantime, we express our deep appreciation to the government and people of Bangladesh for hosting millions of Rohingya refugees while commending all other countries hosting Rohingya people. We call on the international community to redouble humanitarian and development support to Bangladesh and other countries until such a time that safe return is possible. OIC further emphasizes the need to implement relevant UN resolutions, including the Security Council Resolution 2669 and previous UNGA resolutions, and calls for continued engagement by the United Nations, ASEAN, and other international partners to exert sustained pressure on Myanmar to comply with international law and international humanitarian law, among others. In conclusion, OIC reaffirms its collective determination to continue working with the United Nations and all partners to ensure accountability, justice, and dignity for the Rohingya Muslims and other minorities in Myanmar. Together, let us strive for a future of peace, stability, and coexistence in Myanmar and the region. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Turkey and now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Kazakhstan.
Madam President, Excellencies, Kazakhstan appreciates the opportunity to participate in today's conference to exchange views on practical steps for a sustainable and inclusive resolution of the situation of Rohingya Muslims and other minorities in Myanmar. We attach importance to multilateral dialogue and cooperation as the most effective means to advance stability and development. Kazakhstan supports the objectives set out for this meeting to identify avenues for voluntary, safe, and dignified return and reintegration of affected communities in accordance with international standards. In contributing to this discussion, Kazakhstan draws on its own experience in promoting interethnic and interconfessional harmony as a foundation for national development. My President, Kassym-Jomart Tokayev, has emphasized the principle of unity in diversity, the country's consistent policy of tolerance, and the Astana initiative to convene the Congress of Leaders of World and Traditional Religions. These efforts illustrate our belief that inclusive dialogue and mutual respect create durable conditions for peace and cooperation. We view today's exchange as an important step toward collective solutions that respect the rights of minorities, promote inclusive dialogue, and create opportunities for economic and social progress for all communities. Kazakhstan will continue to engage constructively with member states, regional organizations, and relevant UN entities in following up of the outcomes of this conference. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Kazakhstan and now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Egypt.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Madam Vice President, Egypt appreciates the holding of this high-level meeting, which provides a timely platform to mobilize international attention and visibility and to reaffirm the collective commitment of the international community to alleviate the suffering of the Rohingya Muslims and other minorities in Myanmar. Egypt reiterates its deep concern over the continued deterioration of the human rights situation in the country, where Rohingya Muslims and other minorities remain subjected to grave violations, including violence, forced displacement, and long-standing institutionalized discrimination. As a member of the OIC, Egypt reaffirms, together with OIC countries, its unwavering solidarity with the Rohingya Muslims and all minorities in Myanmar who continue to suffer from persecution and exclusion. We echo the repeated warnings regarding renewed violence and destruction of property in the Rakhine state. The failure to put an end to this violence has resulted in the further marginalization of minorities and the denial of their fundamental rights, including the right to life, nationality, health, education, freedom of religion, and freedom of expression. In this regard, we emphasize the urgent need to address the root causes of the crisis, particularly the denial of citizenship and entrenched discriminatory policies that have perpetuated statelessness and vulnerability among Rohingya Muslims. Egypt underscores the urgent need for accountability and justice and support international, independent, and transparent investigations aimed at holding perpetrators for grave violations accountable. We also stress the importance of ensuring the voluntary, safe, dignified, and sustainable return of all forcibly displaced Rohingya currently sheltered in Bangladesh and other host countries. In this regard, we call upon the international community to continue providing the necessary political and financial support to alleviate their suffering, and we express particular appreciation to the efforts of Bangladesh for shouldering the burden of hosting the forcibly displaced Rohingya and urge the international community to assist Bangladesh and other host countries in this regard. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Egypt. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Liechtenstein.
President, the situation of the Rohingya has not received the attention it deserves. The humanitarian situation in Myanmar remains dire, a consequence of the military coup in 2021, which has only worsened the violence against the Rohingya. In that year, Liechtenstein was pleased to coordinate a group of states to present General Assembly Resolution 75/287, which was followed by texts in various political bodies, including Resolution 2669 in the Security Council. On the whole, though, the situation of the Rohingya remains dire, and they are stuck between the predation of the armed forces and the Arakan army. They deserve to be able to return home, but the possibility for them to live in peace in their homeland remains distant at best. The Tatmadaw continues to target civilians, often through airstrikes. These are war crimes, and they should be investigated as such, including on the basis of evidence gathered by the IIMM. These crimes are also in violation of the provisional measures of the ICJ, and we note that the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court has requested an arrest warrant against Min Aung Hlaing. The junta is clearly unpopular, not only in vast parts of the country, but also with its neighbors. Key to understanding how we can work in the space of fragmented governance is to acknowledge the role of internal autonomy and self-determination in Myanmar's history and the role it should play in its future, including through forms of self-governance by ethnic organizations, in particular also the Rohingya. The UN must work with regional organizations, in particular ASEAN, to continue to pressure the junta to end its campaign of atrocity and bring Myanmar back on its democratic path. We're hoping to see a resolution in the Security Council imposing restrictions on the supply of jet fuel, and we encourage states in this assembly to consider a follow-up resolution, especially in the absence of action in the Council. Finally, we are hoping to see a better outcome in the text presented to the Third Committee on the situation of human rights in this season. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Liechtenstein and now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President, for convening today's important conference. The United Kingdom commends Bangladesh for its generous hospitality in hosting Rohingya refugees since 2017. 8 years on, the conflict in Myanmar continues. Systematic blockages of aid and trade exacerbate needs, with malnutrition and food insecurity reaching emergency levels. In Rakhine, 1.5 million people are resorting to extreme coping measures. Without intervention, there is a real risk of famine. Sustained support for Rohingya and host communities in Bangladesh is urgently needed. Today, the UK announced a further $36 million to support Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh. This will focus on meeting the basic urgent needs of refugees, including food, clean water, healthcare, and protection services. The UK has provided a total of $596 million since 2017, and we have also provided over $154 million to support communities in Rakhine State. As well as funding the crisis response, the international community needs to do more to ensure stability in Rakhine. We need to create safe conditions for the Rohingya to be able to return. We call on all actors to ensure full, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access. And all actors must cease violence against civilians, including airstrikes. The UK will continue working with Bangladesh and other partners to support refugees. Our new funding includes support to give the Rohingya skills and tools they can use when they return and to reduce their reliance on aid. Today's conference is an opportunity to maintain focus on the crisis in Rakhine and on dire funding needs in the refugee camps. In a world with so many humanitarian crises, we must not allow the Rohingya crisis to be forgotten. As penholder in the Security Council, we will keep Myanmar on the international agenda. With the unprecedented scale of displacement into Bangladesh, we urge others to join us in increasing financial support and pushing for vital humanitarian access. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Germany.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Germany welcomes that today's conference draws attention to the terrible situation of the Rohingya, a situation unfortunately far too often overlooked. The Rohingya bear the heaviest burden of Myanmar's ongoing civil conflict, but let's not forget other ethnic and religious minorities are also gravely affected. The situation in Rakhine remains a deep concern for us, and the humanitarian situation, we heard it, has worsened and become unbearable. We observe increasing repression, including forced recruitment and sexual and gender-based violence committed by the military, but also by other armed groups. We call on all groups to fully respect human rights and adhere to international humanitarian law. Madam Chair, we wish to express our deep gratitude to the neighboring countries, particularly Bangladesh, which continues to host over 1 million Rohingya despite enormous social and economic challenges. This generosity calls for respect and solidarity. Conditions, though, in the refugee camps in Bangladesh remain challenging. We urge all countries that are able to do so to actively support efforts to improve the situation. Since 2017, Germany has contributed €106 million in humanitarian assistance to improve the situation of the Rohingya in Rakhine and in refugee camps in Bangladesh. Additionally, Germany has provided over €250 million for development-oriented assistance to strengthen the humanitarian development peace nexus. The projects are being implemented in Cox's Bazar, in host communities, and in Myanmar itself. We recognize Bangladesh's desire to find a sustainable solution to the humanitarian and refugee crisis. This requires, we believe, that the preconditions for a safe, voluntary, sustainable, and dignified return to Myanmar are met, and that the civil conflict in the country will finally be brought to an end. We therefore call on the military authorities in Myanmar to end the violence, cease the repression, allow full humanitarian access, release political prisoners, and engage, finally, in a genuine, inclusive dialogue with all stakeholders. In this regard, Germany remains committed to supporting ASEAN's efforts to foster dialogue and keep this crisis high on the international agenda. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Germany. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Algeria.
Guided by our deep commitment to international solidarity and humanitarian values, Algeria expresses its deep concern over the ongoing crisis in Myanmar, which affects its entire people, particularly the Rohingyas. We remain alarmed by the worsening conditions of displacement and the growing funding gap facing humanitarian operations. The international community must uphold its collective responsibility to ensure that life-saving assistance reaches all in need across Myanmar. Algeria joins the call for enhanced and sustained support, particularly as the 2025 Humanitarian Needs and Response Plan remains critically underfunded. Madam President, we believe that inclusive national dialogue is key to building mutual understanding, preserving national unity, and achieving lasting peace in Myanmar. These efforts must respect the country's sovereignty while recognizing the urgent need to address the root causes of this crisis. This approach ensures that everyone can live in safety and dignity regardless of ethnicity or religion. Furthermore, the voluntary, safe, secure, and dignified return of the Rohingya refugees to their homeland is the hope of all. We also underscore the imperative of respecting international humanitarian law and human rights obligations. Madam President, we welcome the continued engagement of ASEAN and the UN as well as their special envoys. Moreover, we encourage efforts that foster reconciliation, confidence building, and social cohesion. In conclusion, Algeria remains committed to a collective and principled approach that prioritizes humanitarian needs, respects national sovereignty, and upholds international law for the prosperity of Myanmar and the well-being of its people, including the Rohingya. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Canada.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I'm delighted to be able to join the conversation today. I think it's important for us to spend the day dealing with this challenging issue. I'd like to express my thanks to the governments of Malaysia and Finland, as well as, of course, to the government of Bangladesh, in particular to Dr. Yunus, who I see in his seat. His leadership in bringing this issue in front of us is extremely important, and we all recognize it. 8 years ago, I was appointed by our government as the special representative on the situation in Myanmar and visited the the camp for the first time in Cox's Bazar in October of 2017. The camp itself is quite incredible. Over 1 million people arriving over a period of 3 or 4 weeks, finding themselves in a part of Bangladesh that was already inhabited by people who lived there and who still live there. So the first thing I want to say is that whatever we do, it has to connect up with the needs of the government and the people of Bangladesh, as well as of the refugees. We can't have a situation where the aid to refugees is seen as taking away from the population of Bangladesh, something that we're all very familiar with, but it's a key issue. And that's why when Canada has targeted its assistance, which we have over $600 million since 2017, it has always been on the basis that we assist, direct assistance to the refugees. We also continue to direct assistance in the form of development aid and in the form of encouraging and incentivizing the World Bank and other international institutions to engage in the development of the region, not just the providing immediate assistance to the refugees, which is critically important, but also making sure that we're looking at the economic prosperity of the whole region. Second thing I want to say is that we have to deal with the situation in Myanmar by addressing the conflict, holding the junta responsible for what's taken place, and making sure that we're dealing with the consequences of the terrible violence that they've inflicted on the people of that country. And finally, I want to just say that it is not just the Rohingya who are facing a challenge. It is also the Chin, the Shan, the Kachin, the Karen, the Karenni, tous ensemble qui sont en face.
All together in this very difficult situation, we have to recognize that indeed we have to be very careful, pay great attention to the problems in that area of the world, and that we acknowledge the needs in the country there.
This problem. We have to recognize that there are no unsolvable problems. It is only when we lack the will.
I thank the representative of Canada. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Spain.
Madam President, Spain observes with great concern the situation of the Rohingya community and that of other minorities in Myanmar, as well as the lack of prospects after more than 8 years of a quest for a lasting solution to the refugee crises that are fleeing towards Bangladesh and other countries. The situation in Myanmar continues to worsen, and the end of the state of emergency is posing additional challenges for the country and for neighbouring countries. In the Rakhine state, the continued episodes of armed violence are compounded by the tragic consequences of natural disasters, the persecution of minorities, forced displacement, famine. Spain, together with the EU, continues to condemn the coup d'etat and urges all parties to the conflict to respect international law and the international humanitarian law, particularly for the civilian population. We also appeal for the parties to the conflict to respect the human rights of the Rohingya population and other minorities in Myanmar. Killings, forced disappearances, torture, forced recruitment all represent grave violations of the rights of these civilians who are very often forced into displacement following the destruction of their homes or basic infrastructure. Spain therefore reiterates its commitment to continue contributing to establishing the conditions that would enable the immediate cessation of all forms of violence and the adoption of decisive measures to restore democracy in Myanmar, ensuring full respect for the will and democratic aspirations of its people. We support the voluntary, safe, dignified and sustainable return of the Rohingya to Myanmar, their country of origin. Nonetheless, while these conditions are not met, we believe that support for Rohingya refugees in the region, in particular in Bangladesh, whose efforts in hosting refugees deserve to be recognized, remains essential. Spain has since 2017 maintained a constant level of support for Rohingya refugees who have fled to other countries in the region, as well as those who remain in Myanmar. These funds stand at more than 4.5 million euros. They have been directed fundamentally to addressing the refugee crisis and to disaster emergency response. We would like to continue working with the international community, the UN and the Bangladeshi government to build a more realistic and compassionate response. We would also think that we should provide a security framework to the Rohingya community to avoid the abuses that they are suffering and the constant violation of their fundamental rights, as well as to promote minimum economic conditions that would allow us to meet their basic needs and guarantee respect of their human dignity. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Spain. We have heard the last speaker for this meeting. We shall continue the plenary segment at 3 p.m. in this same hall. The meeting is adjourned.